So I was saying that when I was with my brother and his friends and my friends, and I decided to go another way and he didn't want to go with me, I was quite disappointed. So I do have this sense of myself, I wasn't a leader and I didn't really influence other people. And I was the youngest in the family, so I didn't have any real influence there. But if I wanted a job, I went out and found a job during the school time, and I'd go down into Oxford on my own, I'd go wandering in the countryside on my own. And when I went to America, and I was on my own from the age of 15, I was very independent, I didn't feel attached to England or my family, and they just let me go my own way, and went through high school, went to college, didn't feel that was for me, and left college, and that's when I had the awakening. So I think there was a real sense of myself as an individual, but not so much as an ego, because when you're dealing with psychology and you're dealing with ego, you're dealing with, I think, a sense of control. You know, you're controlling your conscious mind, you're controlling your decision making, you're controlling the people in your environment. You want control. So in the family, each person wants an element of control. So because they were all older than me, they already had established their positions within that family, within the nuclear family or the group mind. And even with my friends, although I didn't go along with someone because they thought they were in control, I noticed that there were a couple of people that were fighting each other, as it were, egotistically. So when I say egotistically, I mean that one person thought they were physically stronger, or somebody thought they were more intelligent. And I think that if you become a father or mother of a family, your ego takes over, because again, it's a controlling mechanism. And if you're a boss in a company, again, you're managing, controlling. And the point being that in the Freudian model, you've got the instinctual drives, the energies, the aggression, the sexual energies and emotional energies, and they're called the id, the vital energies. And then you've got the superego, which is a kind of moral conscience, and is kind of like a judge or a censor. So like the father, the school teacher, could be kind of a superego. And in between the superego, in the kind of outside world, you might say, in society, and the id, which is like the vital energies in each person in the society, you have the ego. So people in their conscious mind, the ego is supposed to manage the energies coming up from the instincts, which are, you might say, more chaotic and more impulsive, and like sexual desire and aggression, that kind of thing. And you try to moderate that so that you can function in society according to the law and behave yourself in the family and behave yourself in the school and in society in general. And that's how you manage society. So there are always people in control. And of course, to some degree, you've got to be in control of yourself. So I'm seeing the ego as the dominant identity at any given time, like the father might be a dominant identity, or the teacher's a dominant identity, and or any form of identity in the world. You know, if you're a taxi driver or you're an artist, you have a kind of dominant identity, because that's the main role you play in society. And it becomes egotistic when you become very self-centered and you want things your own way. So you're trying to impose some kind of influence and power over the world around you. So, of course, I had an ego in the sense that I was myself. I was myself in the sense, personally speaking, I felt independent, quite free as a self, in myself. But in terms of relationship to the world through the ego, I think my identity was, you might say, quite neutral. So although I wasn't withdrawn or I wasn't afraid of the world, nonetheless I remained quite neutral. And probably I've always been that way all my life, is preferred to be neutral and to not see my freedom in terms of ego control, but my freedom to make decisions that affect my sense of self in what I want to do in the world. Like, I wanted to go to art school, or I wanted to go to India, I wanted to read this book or think my own thoughts and not go along with authority. So when I came into contact with Krishnamurti, I was quite free after my awakening, and I suppose for the first time I had to deal with a kind of hierarchy in the spiritual world. Obviously, when you read the books, you think these people are much older, they know more than me, and they have all these powers, and they can do all these extraordinary things, and so forth. Whereas for me, the only spiritual awareness I had was that I was enlightened and free. That was the only sense of power that I had, and I didn't kind of have any, you might say, attributes or anything special in terms of abilities or psychic powers or anything like that. And but really, overall, that's never bothered me. I've never been interested in psychic powers and altered states and all of that kind of thing anyway. Yeah, I mean, the freedom to do my own thing is very much a 60s idea, I think. And that suited me, that kind of philosophy. So, you know, the different places I lived, if I squatted a house in London or in the countryside, and there was an abandoned house or a house that wasn't being lived in and was going to be demolished or something, then I'd go and live in there, and a few people would live with me. I might open up the house and a few people will come along from the alternative community or from the different communes and things like that passing through London. And I just feel very free, I feel independent, and even if it was cold in the house and it was quite rough, that wouldn't bother me because I had my freedom. It didn't cost very much to live and I didn't need much money. And I didn't have any property, just a few clothes. And that suited me for about 10 years. I lived like that, from say 68 to late 70s. So I think this thing of freedom as a principle has everything to do with yourself. You know, it's you that are living, you grow up and it's you that are the individual, you know, before society, before other people, before anything else, even before interests and what you're going to do and everything like that. As a child growing up, I think either you have a sense of yourself as an individual and you sense your own freedom, or you don't, because some people might be so dominated by their family or so dominated by society and so forth that maybe people don't have that direct understanding that you're free, because they're so limited in their choices based on the conditioning of their family. Whereas my parents were quite liberated in the sense that they never imposed any belief system on me. That's just an example. But I think if you look at animals, you feel whether they're birds or cats and dogs and things like that. I mean, they're just alive with that kind of energy, the natural energy, the life force, and they're just free. I mean, we can call it freedom. They're just free, and that's why I like nature a lot, and I like creativity a lot. And yeah, I think the most fundamental state of mind, you could say, of a self, of an individual, is their sense of freedom. And I think their sense of freedom is not the same as free choice. You know, when people say free will, you know, do we have free will, or are we determined by our genetic structure? Are we determined by our conditioning from society and the family? I think freedom is a quality. Freedom is something innate in us, and it's not simply about consciousness and thought and knowledge. It's not about the body and the instincts. I do think spiritually there is something else going on, and I think that's important to distinguish between the spiritual and the psychic and the physical, which is full of content, which is full of activity, which is full of conditions. My view of spirituality and enlightenment is that freedom is freedom, not freedom from anything, but freedom is a kind of spiritual gift, you might say. You know, some people are born with an artistic gift, some people can speak well, some people can organize well. And I think my gift is my sense of freedom. So I don't go along with the idea that freedom is reducible to free will or free choice, because choice is, I think, is what happens with the ego. And I mean by ego, just the dominant identity, you know, in society. So in my family, although they knew I was an individual and they were individuals, whereas together I was the son, I was the brother, and then I was the student. So that's what I would call the ego. There's yourself, and everybody's their self as individuals, and everybody knows that we're all playing a role. You know, father, mother, brother, sister, teacher, worker, boss, hierarchy. We all know we're playing roles. And I think each person really does have freedom. I think they're spiritually free, and I think they know it. I think each person actually knows that. They don't need Krishnamurti or gurus or teachers or the politicians and the sociologists and the psychologists. They don't need any of them to tell them what to do. So free choice is, to me, is when you're in society, and that society can be the family, for example. When you're in society, that means with other people, then you make choices. You know, am I going to go for a walk with my brother or not? Am I going to do what my mother tells me or not? Am I going to wear these clothes or not? Am I going to go out with my friends or not? That kind of free choice, you know, whether you're going to stay in this country or leave. I mean, if you're in a war zone, you don't have to leave. If you want to leave, you leave. And all that kind of choice is really going on in your consciousness and your thought. So you get the choices between two thoughts, and those two thoughts are based on your memory and the knowledge in your memory. In other words, the conditions of your past life. So if you're brought up as a Christian and you're told about good and evil, then that might determine the way you make choices. Is it good? Is it evil? And somebody else, it might be in a secular society, do you like that? Or don't you like that? Or does that make you happy? Or does that make you feel good? Is it the good life or not? So I see free choice in that sense, not to do with self and spirit and enlightenment, which I believe each person's born with, and each person has that within themselves all of their life. And I think it's arrogance for people in authority, in society, to try to say that people don't have that freedom. Like Krishnamurti, he would not admit that other people have enlightenment, have that freedom. So he wants to say, I know what freedom is. It's freedom from knowledge, it's freedom from thought. So he makes a kind of problem out of thought and knowledge and consciousness. So he's kind of blaming something for his lack of freedom. Like the church would blame science, or the church would blame nature and say nature's corrupt, nature's imperfect. That kind of playing off one thing against another. And as I say, when I first went to see Krishnamurti, I had my sense of freedom. I realized that the human being's free within themselves. And I didn't go along with any of the teaching. I found it very incomprehensible. I found it idiosyncratic. I found it contradictory, and so forth. And I just didn't think he really made sense. And he was making these kind of statements about, like you'd read it in a kind of a moral text or something, you know, you should do this or not do this, and it's unintelligent to do this, it's intelligent to do that, and so forth and so on. And kind of using, you might say, a kind of argument that was like playing one thing off against another, one principle off against another, which is really indicative of his religious upbringing. I mean, he was born as a Brahmin, which is the highest caste in India. His father was deeply into theosophy and Hinduism, and he was trained by the theosophists until his late 20s to be a religious teacher, to be a world teacher, to be an incarnation of Buddha, as it were, Buddha Maitreya. So I mean, right up until, I would say, his mid-30s, he was totally conditioned in a moral way, in a religious way. And I think he never shook that off. I think he was a religious teacher, and he wielded a certain degree of power and influence. He had all these schools, he was the president of all the schools, and more or less it was well known that he didn't feel that the schools were producing people like him. They weren't producing intelligent people. And he told the students, he told the teachers that the schools weren't really working to produce intelligent people, basically, i.e. people like him. And he never acknowledged that anybody shared the same state of awareness as him, that he had reached the highest level. Whereas I'm saying everybody is already on that highest level. Everybody is enlightened. Everybody is spiritual, and everybody is a free self. That's my, if I've got anything to say to the spiritual community, that's what I would say. Respect people for their freedom, their innate individuality, their innate intelligence. Treat them as intelligent people, which of course the hierarchy of society, the hierarchy of history doesn't treat people as if they're intelligent, when every single animal is intelligent. So why isn't every child intelligent? Of course they are. No, people love to tell other people what to do. And in a sense, you could say, if you get the idea of free will, which is making choices in society, so in yourself you're free, you can just be in a room, read a book, watch a film, talk to somebody, go for a walk. You're free, you're an individual. And if you've got to make decisions in terms of other people in the world, as it were, then, then you've got to go into your memory, as it were, go into your conditions from your past, go into the knowledge you have, and work out what you're going, work out what decision you're going to make. And that content of consciousness, or memory and thought and knowledge, that's what's called conditioning. Right, they're the condition, they're your particular human condition. That's the accumulation of all the conditions of your past. So we've all got this storehouse of conditions, and we're making decisions in the present about what to do next. So you have past, present, future, and you make your decisions. Now you could call that determinism. In a way, your knowledge determines the kind of decisions you're making. Fine, that's fine. You're doing a painting, and you might say, oh, I can choose between red and green. I think I'll choose the green. Or you're going to talk to somebody and you think, well, I'll choose those words to say, or those words. Of course you're being conditioned by language and knowledge and the past. Of course you are. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the whole of nature works on habit from the past. It's a ritual. So of course you do that. Most of the things done in society are ritualistic. There's nothing wrong with that. It's got nothing to do with your freedom. So free will and determinism are really problems of consciousness, not problems of self. The spiritual sense of self doesn't have psychological problems, doesn't have social problems, doesn't have problems of knowledge, problems of conditions. That's my point of view. The Buddhist idea is that when Buddha entered enlightenment, it was a liberation from conditioning, what they call Maya, the veil of illusion. And you've got to ask yourself, what kind of conditioning are you talking about? No, because nobody knows anything about the Buddha. So all of the Buddhist texts are written by people that came after Buddha and created an institution called Buddhism. Right? So it's got really nothing to do with the Buddha. So the Buddha, this person's supposed to have been enlightened, and he shared that awareness with some of his family and friends, and maybe he enlightened a couple of people, we don't know. But that's the story. But the actual text, the actual doctrine, the dogma of liberation from conditions obviously meant something to the people that wrote that. And of course you can make your own interpretations. So if we look at the species, the human race, we could call everything that's ever happened on this planet in terms of the species, we could call that the human condition, right? So every human being that's ever lived lives within the human condition. And the human condition is related to evolution in the sense, I wouldn't use the word evolution because I don't think human consciousness came from the animal kingdom. I think consciousness and psyche exists in a dimension other than the physical body. So hypothetically, when you go into dreams and astral levels and spiritual levels, you're going away from your body. And maybe that is indicative that when we die, the body dies, we go into these other levels. That's my point of view. So we're talking about the human condition as an accumulation of conditions that we call the past, that we call history. So that's the human condition. Now, living on this planet, those experiences we call the human condition go into our memory, and then we have thinking in the psyche. We think about what we've experienced in the world and what we think about that. So all of that knowledge of the physical world and the psychic world is in our memory as the human condition. So you're brought up as a Christian, you're brought up secular, you're brought up believing in good and evil, you're brought up making choices about whether you're going to be educated or not. That's all the different kinds of, you might say, human condition. What I'm saying is each person is born a free self. Each person is aware of the spiritual nature. Each person really is in touch with the spiritual dimension. So within the individual, there is the physical body and the physical conditions. There's the psychic body, as it were, or the dream body or the astral body, and the psychic conditions. And when you talk about the spiritual conditions, those are not quite the same as the, you might say, infinitely complex conditions of the physical universe and the infinitely complex conditions of the psyche with all of the thought processes and thought forms and astral travel and seeing entities and all of that. Very, very complex. Those two fields are very complex. I think the spiritual is much simpler. And in fact, they say that nirvana is really emptiness, almost like free of conditions. So the dogma is that nirvana, when you go and you're liberated, you're kind of in a place of emptiness. You're in a place that is unconditioned. But that's only in comparison to the conditions. You say unconditioned, but there are things related to the spiritual dimension, like the bodhisattvas and the Buddhas of meditation, the qualities of love and beauty and justice. All these spiritual values, they're all part of the spiritual world. So it's not as if it's literally empty. It's only empty of the conditioning, because you're liberating yourself from the conditions of the psychic and the physical. So that's the human condition. You're in the human condition as an identity and an ego within your consciousness. And so you make your choices within that consciousness, which are conditioned. Now, another point about Buddhism, what they say is, living within the human condition as a human being on this planet is a condition of suffering. So they're saying literally that to be a human being in the psyche and in the physical sense of the conditions, that's actually suffering. And they say that more or less you grow up, and at some point you're going to get ill and you're going to die, which is a form of, they would see that as a form of suffering. You're going to get you get illnesses and all kinds of diseases and stuff like that. That's one point. Another point would be that as an ego, as an identity, you're always desiring to be free, to have more money in your pocket, to do better at work, to have a good family. You're always wanting something better. You're always wanting perfection. You're always wanting a sense of freedom from those conditions that hold you back, from those negative conditions, or the conditions of illness, or the conditions of failure, or whatever. And the whole hierarchy of society is actually based on that kind of desire for power, for freedom, for influence, to be a better person, to be higher up. So you can understand how people might think that kind of hierarchy is something best got rid of. You know, it's best to not live in a world where there is this kind of domination. So you can understand liberation from that type of conditioning. My point would be, rather than saying, oh, the Buddha was free, he went into enlightenment, I would rather say that going into enlightenment is something in itself. I think it's not freedom from the known, as Krishnamurti said, maybe copying it from, imitating the Buddhist doctrine, but putting it in his own words. Because Krishnamurti said that he didn't follow any particular sacred text, but everything he said was actually, you might say, a rethinking of those sacred texts. So fundamentally, he would be seen more or less as a Buddhist anyway. So my point is, the child is a free spiritual being. When you grow up and you maybe have an awakening, then you realise that you are free. And and then that self-awareness, in a sense, reflects back on your past, on your childhood, like I've done, and I realise, yes, the human being, the child, is free anyway, but they've forgotten it because society demands that they function as an ego identity, and you forget your freedom because you're serving society. you're serving other people, you're imitating them, you believe that your real life is in society and making choices in society, and your real sense of freedom is being taken over. So again, this idea of society is a kind of imprisonment of the self. But it's not the self that's imprisoned, it's the identity that's imprisoned. So if you're a Buddhist and you're trying to be free of conditioning or understand conditioning, that's only the identity of the Buddhist. I am a Buddhist and I want to be free like Buddha. But I'm saying that isn't the way to look at enlightenment. That's not really, to me, what the true nature of the Buddha is. I think the Buddha, when he sat under the Bodhi tree, that's a metaphor, that's a symbol that he no longer was studying the sacred texts, as they say. He was no longer a yogi, but he went back home and he lived in his hometown, as it were, and he was just living, he gave up spiritual, you might say, a spiritual way of life that was predicated on the religious doctrine or the religious conditioning, and he was just an ordinary person, and he was living his life, and he had an awakening. And that awakening meant that he went out of his body, as it were, into nirvana. Now, when I had my awakening, I didn't leave my body and go into another dimension. I simply woke up, as it were, in a state of enlightenment and freedom, and I see that as an aspect of nirvana, but with an embodied sense. Whereas I think Buddha went out of his body to nirvana in an otherworldly or objective sense. But I don't think there's any difference between the two, just simply that one is embodied and one's disembodied, as it were. So my view, actually, is that when you grow up and you're conditioned by society, conditioned by the ego, and by the identity that you're wearing, as it were, like a persona, but that you're identified with being an artist, you're identified with being a father, mother, but your true self is actually already free, but you've forgotten that, or it's not that you've forgotten it, you never remembered it, you just grew up as a child and you just moved into being an ego consciousness, as it were. You didn't think about it, you just grew up. And then you woke up, as it were, to the fact that you are free, you're self-aware and you're free, and you're not bound by your ego or your identity. And I think that is what the spiritual tradition is about. It's really about whether you wake up or not. That's the spiritual tradition. Now, if you go to meditation and you read books about being free like the Buddha or something like that, then you're practicing, you're working towards that freedom, you're doing levels of meditation, levels of study, levels of inquiry, but that isn't spiritual, that's psychic. Like in Jungian psychology, psychoanalysis, mythology, symbolism, individuation, all those things are psychic, and Jung said that they all take place in the psyche. I'm saying that there is that the self is spiritual. The self you can wake up to that fact that you're free, enlightened individual, and that is the spiritual. So, since my awakening as a spiritual person, you might say, I have been processing knowledge, I have been processing my experience, I have been processing symbols and sacred texts and my experiences of synchronicity and visions and dreams. I have been processing that more or less for 50 years, and I'm saying that that is something I feel I had to do, and that was my life in the world. We've all got a life in the world, we've all got an identity in the world, and we're living in our consciousness in the world. There's nothing wrong with that. You can be an artist, you can be a parent, you can work for whatever company you work for. Whatever people do in their consciousness is their problem, is their world. But I've never mixed that up with being a spiritually enlightened person. That's never been a point of confusion. So I don't believe in any form of dogma. I don't care what the Buddhists say about Buddha. I don't care what the Christians say about Christ, or what people say about the Tao, or what people say about shamanism. I don't care. You know, people can interpret in any way they want. So you have to make your own inquiry and make up your own mind based on your own intelligence, and not to follow any form of dogma and say, oh, in Buddhism you've got 3 schools of Buddhism. You've got the Tibetan Buddhists, you've got the Buddhists of the Southern School, the Theravadins, and you've got the Zen. And they've all got different belief systems, they've all got different biases. One of the Tibetan Buddhism, they like mythology and symbolism. Zen Buddhism doesn't want any form of symbolism. It doesn't even want a philosophy, whereas the Theravadins are very psychological and philosophical, and they don't want any symbolism. So you've got those 3 schools, and so you could say to yourself, well, what is Buddhism? Well, Buddhism is a doctrine, Buddhism is a conditioning, Buddhism is an interpretation. It's got nothing to do with the actual Buddha. Just like if I take my own life, I mean, if people see my books studying Egyptian magic and occultism and all of that kind of thing, and mythology and the Bible and Zen Buddhism and everything like that, that's my identity in the world. That's got nothing to do with me as an individual. It's got nothing to do with my freedom and my individuality. I don't care what people think of me and say, oh, he's an occultist, or he's this and he's that, and so forth. Well, I mean, in my consciousness, in my identity, you can say whatever you like. Of course I'm an occultist, I'm an artist, I'm an English person. Of course you can say that. It's got nothing to do with me. And whatever I think about you, that's got nothing to do with you as an individual, as a spiritually free person. I respect that. And all we're doing is sharing information. In the human species, in the human community, all we're doing is sharing our cultural understanding. We're sharing the knowledge of our culture with each other. Within England or within the world, we're just sharing the culture and so forth and so on. That's all we're doing as free spiritual individuals. So nothing can make you free other than to be enlightened, and we don't know where that comes from. We don't know what that is. That's why you can't speak for the Buddha. Nobody knows what happened to the Buddha unless it happens to you. And if it happens to you, you know that you can't put a label on it. You know it's not to do with your consciousness. It's not to do with culture. It's not to do with ego. It's something else. And that something else is not the psyche, and it's not the body. That's all I can say. I don't know what it is, because it's empty, it's freedom, it's other, and why give it a name? If you're free, you're free.